but who had then become glum because he had most decidedly not taken the king's commission in order to end up renting guns to Joseph Stalin. He had loathed the morose, graceless reception he got when his ship docked under the gaze of the Red Navy, and because almost everything since that great Boxing Day had been headed downhill. The Empire and the Navy were being wound up fast. The colors were being struck from Malaya in the east to Cyprus and Malta nearer home. The senior service itself was being cut to the bone. When I was born in Portsmouth, my father was on board a ship called the Warrior, anchored in an arbor that had once seen scores of aircraft carriers and great gray battleships pass in review. In Malta, there had still been a shimmer or a scintilla of greatness to the Navy. But by the time I was old enough to take notice, the commander was putting on his uniform only to go to a stone frigate, a non-seagoing dockside office in Plymouth, where they calculated things in ledgers. Every morning on the BBC until I was 6, I would hear the newscaster utter the name Sir Winston Churchill, who was then Prime Minister. There came the day when this stopped, and my childish ears received the strange name Sir Anthony Eden, who had finally succeeded the old lion. Within a year or so, Eden had tried to emulate Churchill by invading Egypt at Suez, and pretending that Britain could simultaneously do without the UN and the United States. International and American revenge was swift, and from then on the atmosphere can't even be described as a long, withdrawing roar, since the tide of the Empire and Dominion merely and sadly ebbed. We won the war, or did we? This remark, often accompanied by a meaning and shooting glance at an air of significance, was a staple conversation between my father and his rather few friends as the decanter went round. Later in life, I'm very sorry to say, it helped me to understand the stab-in-the-back mentality that had infected so much of German opinion after 1918. You might call it the politics of resentment. These men had borne the heat and burden of the day, but now the only chatter in the press was of cheap and flashy success in commerce. Now the colonies and bases were being mortgaged to the Americans, who, as we were invariably told, had come almost lethargically late to the struggle against the Axis. Now there were ridiculous, posturing, self-inflated leaders like Kenyatta and Makarios and Nkrumah, where only very recently the Union Jack had guaranteed prosperity under law. This grievance was very deeply felt, but was also, except in the company of fellow sufferers, rather repressed. The worst thing the Navy did to the commander was to retire him against his will sometime after Suez, and then and only then to raise the promised pay and pension of those officers who would later join up. This betrayal by the Admiralty was a never-ending source of upset and rancor. The more wartime service and action you had seen, the less of a pension you received. The commander would write letters to the Navy ministers and members of Parliament, and he even joined an association of on-the-beach ex-officers like himself. But one day, when tiring of his plaintiveness, I told him that nothing would change until he and his comrades marched in a phalanx to Buckingham Palace and handed back their uniforms, swords, and scabbards and medals. He was quite shocked. "Oh," he responded, "we couldn't think of doing that." Thus did I begin to see, or thought I began to see, how the British Conservatives kept the fierce, irrational loyalty of those whom they exploited. He's a Tory. I was much later to hear of some dogged loyalist. But he's got nothing to be Tory about. My thoughts immediately flew to my father, whose own devoted and brave loyalism had been estimated so cheaply by what I was then calling the ruling class. When I say that we didn't hold much converse, I suppose that I should blame myself as well as him. But in some ways I don't blame myself that much. At the age of 10 or so, I turned from the newspaper to ask him why the paratroopers from Algeria were threatening to occupy Paris and proclaim a military coup d'etat in mainland France. His typical two-word response, Gallic temperament, rather dried up my interest in pursuing the subject any further. But I disappointed him too, I know. He would have liked me to be good at games and sports, as he was. I couldn't even pretend to care about cricket or rugby or any of that. Convinced that I might want to earn my colors instead as some kind of scout, he went to a huge amount of trouble to send me at my prep school miniature versions of complicated knots executed in string and pipe cleaner and neatly diagrammed. I had bothered to master these. Had I bothered to master these, I could have perhaps later made better headway with the nautico-literary descriptions of the vessels and ropes of Hornblower and Aubrey, and their hilliards and bowlines and main braces, the most alarming of the latter being the cunt splice, demanded by Captain Aubrey from his boatswain in a heated moment, about which I could certainly never have asked Commander Hitchens. He was quite a small man, and when he took off his uniform, or had it taken away from him, and went to work as a bookkeeper, looked very slightly shrunken. For as long as he could, he took jobs that kept him near the sea, especially near the Hampshire-Sussex coast. He would work for a boat builder there, a speedboat manufacturer there. We finally drifted inland, near to the center of my mother's beloved Oxford, where there was a boys' prep school that needed an accountant, and he seized the chance to acquire a dog. I hadn't realized until then quite how much he preferred the predictability and loyalty of animals to the vagaries and frailties of human beings. Late in life, the landlords of the apartment buildings where he lived were to tell him that he couldn't keep his red setter retriever mix, a lovely animal named Beckett. The now beached commander couldn't afford to move house again, so instead of protesting, he meekly gave the dog away. But not before mooting with me a plan to establish Beckett somewhere else, so that I could go and visit him from time to time. Again I had the experience of a moment of piercing pity, of the sort I could only now imagine feeling for a child of mine, whom it was beyond my power to help. I do have a heroic memory of him from my boyhood, and it happens to concern water. We were at a swimming pool party, held at the local golf and country club, that was almost but not quite out of our social orbit. When I heard a splash and saw the commander fully clothed in the shallow end, pipe still clamped in his mouth, I remember hoping that he had not fallen in front of all these people, because of the gin. Then I saw that he was holding a little girl in his arms. She had been drowning quietly just outside her depth, until someone had squealed in alarm, and my father had been the speediest man to act. I remember two things about the aftermath. The first was the commander's no fuss anyone would have done attitude to those who slapped him on the back in admiration. That was absolutely in character and to be expected. But the second was the glare of undisguised rage and hatred from the little girl's father, who should have been paying attention, and who had instead been quaffing and laughing with his pals. That hateful look taught me a lot about human nature in a short time. Otherwise, I am rather barren of paternal recollections, and shall have to settle for the memory of a few walks, and for the strange cult of golf. Seafarer though he was, my father loved the downlands of Hampshire and Sussex, and later Oxfordshire, and could stride along with his trusty stick, pointing out here a steading and there a ridgeway. He was a Saxon in his own way, and still had the attitude, now almost extinct, that there had been such a thing as the Norman yoke imposed upon this ancient landscape and people. A favorite joke on his side of the family concerned with the Hampshire yeoman in dispute with his squire. I suppose you know, observes the squire loftily, that my ancestors came over with William the Conqueror. Yes, responds the yeoman, we were waiting for you. In an alternative version once offered by the rogue Marxist Welshman Raymond Williams, the yeoman tries to be witty and says, "Oh yes, and how are you liking it over here?" I mention this because a certain kind of British conservatism is quite closely connected with this folk memory of populism and ethnicity, and because it became important for me to comprehend this later on. The golf game must have taken place when I was about 13. I had taken up the sport and even got myself a few clubs, with the idea that I thought to have something in common with my reticent old man, who loved golf and treasured a pewter mug he had once won in the Navy tournament held on the deck of an aircraft carrier. My effort paid off. If only once we had a round of 9 holes that somehow went well for both of us. And then he treated me to a heavy tea in the clubhouse, where if nothing much got said, there was no tension or awkwardness either. It was the closest I ever came or felt to him. There was a very soft and beautiful dusk. I remember as we drove slowly and quietly home through the purple and yellow gorse of the moors. Once I had left home for university, and then London, and once my mother had been taken from us, and once he had to hear, and from his son at that Yvonne had not been murdered, but had slain herself while distraught about another man. A very slight but definite coolness replaced the respectful distance that had developed between me and the commander. More than anything, this chill consisted of a subject, the prior existence of his wife and my mother, that he simply would not and could not discuss with me. Over time, all the same, there was the occasional thaw. He disliked coming to London on principle, and had enraged me when I was younger by refusing to take a job as a secretary of Brooks's club. I could have been living in London, in Mayfair for heaven's sake, and when I was a teenager. But I did once lure him to the destined city to see a musical about Fats Waller, an uncharacteristic favorite of his called Your Feet's Too Big. And he once astonished me by asking in the late 70s if I'd care to come with him to the reunion of his old shipmates. Turning up at some down-at-heel Navy Veterans Club on the appointed night, I was quick to realize that this late muster was almost certainly going to be the last one for the fine company that had once crewed the good ship Jamaica. But how brave and modest and honest and unassuming they were. These men who had bucketed through icy storms and every kind of peril in order to sweep Hitler from the seas. An oddly touching detail stays with me. Instead of referring to my father as Eric or the commander, they called him Hitch, which is what my close friends were beginning to call me. At around this time, I was starting to turn my thoughts and ambitions towards America, which the grizzled veteran showed no interest in visiting. In uniform, at any rate, he had been everywhere from China to Chile to Cyprus to Ceylon, but the New World held no charms for him, and at our infrequent meetings, he never evinced any curiosity about the place. If he asked a question on another topic, it would be of the rhetorical kind. Don't you think Northern Ireland could do with a good stiff dose of martial law? Almost as if force had never yet been tried in the black record of British rule in Ireland. And if he made a statement, there might very well be a rhetorical element there too. If they build this bloody Channel tunnel and join us to France, he once said in what I'd call classical statement of his worldview, I shall never vote Conservative again. I sometimes used to wonder if he was saying these things for effect, or even because of the gin. But if challenged, he would restate these things even more decidedly, a tendency I have since come to notice and sometimes to deplore in myself. He must have known that he had some kind of red for a son, but he seemed to manage to talk to me as if I still had elementary Saxon common sense, and I was very affected when I discovered that, by stealth to his small circle of friends, he was giving Christmas gift subscriptions to my Pinko magazine, The New Statesman. Rather interesting piece by my son in that last issue. Don't know if you noticed it. Did this make up for my failures as a sportsman? I doubt it, but then I had to ask myself if I had chosen the field of journalism to compensate for other shortcomings on the field of valor. On this point, too, he administered more of a shock to me than he can have intended. After I had returned from a visit to Lebanon in the mid-70s, and a trip to the war zone in the south of that country that I had later written up for the magazine, I was sitting at my desk one afternoon when the telephone rang, and it was the commander. This occurrence was rare enough in itself to make me worry that something might be amiss. But he was calling to say that he had admired my article, and, while I was still searching for the words in which to respond, he in effect doubled the stakes by saying that he thought it had been rather brave of me to go there. And then, as I grappled with that rather vertiginous development, he said goodbye and replaced the receiver. A man of few words, as I believe I have said. At the time, I couldn't make any definite connection between my own visits to the places where he had been stationed, from the South Atlantic to the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and the commander's earlier presence there. I myself could not picture how these one-time colonies must have looked when viewed through the massive ship's gun sight, or from the deck of a superbly engineered war machine. In truth, when a Cyprus or Palestine or Southern Africa or elsewhere. I generally felt myself so much in sympathy with those who had resisted British rule that I thought it better for the commander and myself to avoid the subject. If you had asked me about the likelihood of a Union Jack flying again over Basra or Khyber Pass, I would have both mocked and scorned the idea. Yet when the Argentine fascist junta invaded the Falkland Islands in the early days of 1982, just after I had immigrated to New York, I felt a sudden stab of partisanship for the Royal Navy as it sailed out to reverse the outcome. I even wrote to the commander in fairly gung-ho terms, hoping for a hint of common ground. His response surprised and even slightly depressed me. I don't know if it frightens the enemy, he wrote about Britain's last war-footing fleet as it found its inexorable way to the South Atlantic, but it certainly frightens me. This slightly hackneyed borrowing from what the Duke of Wellington had said of his infamous army, of drunken and homicidal riffraff on the eve of Waterloo, left me feeling flat. Waterlooville was the name of a suburb of Portsmouth, and there was a celebrated pub called the Heroes of Waterlooville, whose inn sign showed the redcoats smashing Bonaparte's old guard, so he had to know that I would find his historical allusion slightly trite. On reflection, though, I am able to see what I did learn from my father. I had once thought that he had helped me understand the Tory mentality, all the better to combat and repudiate it. And in that respect, he was greatly, if accidentally, instructive. But over the longer stretch, I have come to realize that he taught me, without ever intending to, what it is to feel disappointed and betrayed by your own side. He had a certain idea of England, insecular to a degree and conservative for sure, but not always, or not necessarily, reactionary. In this England, patient merit would take precedence over the insolence of office, and people who earned their money would accord more respect than people who merely had it, or made it. The antiquity and tranquility of the landscape and the coastline would likewise have earned their share of deference. Those who wanted to uproot or develop an area would have to make a case for change rather than be permitted the glib and clever assumption that change was a good thing in itself.